edition of the program with the author, the columnist, the general brilliant contributor to the War of Ideas, Mark Steyn. And that clip, Mark, was an Ambassador Ihab Gamaladin speaking, I guess 2 years ago now, almost to the day, before the Human Rights Council of the United Nations about something that you obviously do in an egregious way, which is to say hurt the religious feelings of more than 1 billion people. And I understand that you've actually been prosecuted for such misconduct. Shed light on both what is going on here and what you've been doing about it.
Well, the Canadian Islamic Congress complained about an excerpt from my book, America Alone, that appeared in Canada's biggest news magazine, Maclean's, which is like, I guess, Time and Newsweek combined. And they took me and Maclean's to 3 human rights commissions at the federal level, in Ontario and in British Columbia, where I was for a week-long trial, one day of which...
You might just say, Mark, because we are not probably as familiar as we should be with the sort of star chambers of these human rights commissions in Canada. What are they, and how do they operate?
Well, they're basically a kind of drive-through justice that sprang up in the
Not to be confused with drive-by shooting.
Yeah, well, it often feels like that if you're on the receiving end.
Yeah, I imagine.
The traditional protections of common law, the right to confront your accuser in open court, the defense of truth, the presumption of innocence, all these things are gone here because they were designed for a multicultural age that the left thought was going to be very easy. They thought it was going to be, for example, nice Jews against old ancient Nazis. They thought it was going to be gay people against homophobic people. They thought it was going to be nice black people against racist whites. Well, then you have these Islamic lobby groups in Canada and elsewhere in the West that are prepared to use the tools of multiculturalism to advance essentially a unicultural agenda. And you heard it very clearly.
Unicultural meaning
by unicultural,
supremacy
I mean,
of Islam.
That we all, in effect, have to live under the strictures of Shariah, of Islamic law.
Yeah.
That Egyptian ambassador makes the point. A Muslim doesn't believe you should draw or paint representations of Muhammad. Now, there are some very famous ones that have been used.
Like on the Supreme Court of the United States.
Yes, and in many, you'll find them in European museums, in many history books too. You'll find it in Dante's Circle of Hell, which has been illustrated by many prominent artists. I quite accept that if you're a practicing Muslim and you don't believe you should have representations of the Prophet, that's fine for you as a Muslim. But for the many people around the world who aren't Muslims, that's something they can choose or not choose to observe as they see fit. And what this Egyptian ambassador is proposing is that essentially the whole planet now will live under a de facto Islamic law.
Right.
That what Muslims believe, you as a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew or whatever are also obliged to sign on to too. And what I find scary about that, I mean, there's no surprise that an Egyptian ambassador from a country that has no freedom of speech should say such things. But what is more problematic to me is the number of, for example, European foreign ministers who would gladly agree with him. They think for the sake of a quiet life, that they should string along with that. That in a way you can have Sharia light. You can write a couple of stops on the Sharia Express. You won't have to go all the way to female circumcision and beheadings and all the rest of it.
Stonings.
But you can just go a couple of stops down the line and then get off at some sort of reasonable point before you've gone too far down the track.
It's the local, not the express.
Yeah, that's right. And you'll be surprised, by the way, how fast that express train goes once you're
and the doors don't open at your stop.
That's right. That's right.
Well, and this is all the more appropriate because one of the fellows that I know you have admired, as I have, for having suffered, in fact, his travails continue after years have, I guess, been wrapped up relatively satisfactorily, though we do want to hear about your appearance before the Parliament in Canada about all that. But Geert Wilders, or Geert Wilders, depending on how you want to pronounce it, the Dutch parliamentarian, is being prosecuted in his own country, Netherlands, arguably the most tolerant of all of the Europeans, pursuant to precisely this kind of idea, right?
Yes. And I think that's you use the word tolerance. The Netherlands is supposedly the most tolerant country in Europe. It has, in the army, you're allowed to have long hair. They've got legalized pot. They've got legalized prostitution. They've got legalized everything. Right. And what they have only just begun to realize is if you're the most tolerant country in Europe and you import large numbers of people from a culture that even at its most benign has no particular track record for tolerance, your society is going to change. Yeah. I think I say somewhere in America alone that when people used to talk about Iraq as an artificial entity and the Kurds and the Shia and the Sunni, they don't all fit together. It's silly to try and fit them together in one country. It's an artificial notion. Well, what do you call the modern-day city of Amsterdam, where you have essentially an Islamic republic in embryo living side by side with the sort of hippie anything goes, pot, drugs, sex, whatever you bag.
Side by side for the moment, but soon on top. Before we get to the unholy alliance that Obama has now forged with the Organization of the Islamic Conference, just give us a little bit more flavor of your testimony with, I guess, Ezra Levant, another Canadian who was prosecuted in this, as I say, star chamber up in Canada. But you testified recently with Ezra before your parliament. I don't know if it's your parliament anymore. You're here more than you're there, I gather. But your home of origin, I guess they call it.
Unlike Geert Wilders, who was,
a man without a country,
who was kicked out of Heathrow Airport. I'm still allowed to drive across the border.
Well, thank God for that.
Into Canada.
If only to stand trial.
I got a very warm welcome, oddly enough, at the House of Commons in Ottawa, and Ezra and I were testifying to the House of Commons Select Committee on Justice about getting the Section 13 hate speech law basically scrapped. We think, my view is, if you're going to have a so-called multicultural society, you don't need sensitivity training, you need insensitivity training. The only way it's going to work is if we all develop thick skins and learn to rub along together. And this idea, which I'm very concerned about, that it seems to come naturally to the Canadian and European political class and to at least 50% of the American political class, that somehow government, you can have countries made up of hostile identity groups with government as the sole legitimate arbiter of the relations between those groups. I think that is the death of liberty. We're seeing it already in Europe, and I think we've made modest progress toward reversing it and restoring liberty in Canada. And I'm concerned that even as we're doing that, we're seeing reverses in the United States, in Europe, and at the United Nations.
Yes, let's talk about those. As you say, you're campaigning now in Canada to ban the so-called hate speech, which as a practical matter means banning or at least constricting freedom of expression, at the very moment that the U.S. Congress is enacting hate speech legislation, and simultaneously we've got the Obama administration joining forces with this, I call it the Muslim Mafia, though there's now a new book by that name, so I'm going to have to come up with a new name.
Right.
The Organization of the Islamic Conference, to make this sort of international norm, banning such freedom of expression. Talk to us about what you think this leads inevitably to here in the United States.
Well, I think the Organization of the Islamic Conference is a voting bloc of, I think it's 57 or 58 nations now, including some countries like Russia, which increasingly have an interest in forging an alliance with that Muslim bloc in a very practical sense. and they dominate the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is, in fact, an anti-human rights council. Yeah. It's not about rights.
It's Orwell.
Yeah, it is. It's an Orwellian use of the term. Human rights, to me, are defined by what the barons did to King John at Magna Carta in 1215. Magna Carta says